Hi. Apologies if I'm very full. I might not move very well for a while. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a participatory artist, and by that I mean I don't really make anything alone. But I consider myself to be a textile artist, even though I don't make any finished textiles. And I just want to say, based on the discussions at the end of this morning, that number 8 is important to me, which is rather sad, but which interestingly fits into 24s as well, but mainly because of the coding link and binary. I work across various mediums. I work from the extreme of really simplistic materials like paper, plastic, stickers, through to digital work, and even more recently a bit of Minecraft. Anything that's pixel-based, basically. Lately, I've been exploring sort of weaving and code crossovers. And most importantly, that I wanted to talk about today is that I've been looking at the theory of flow and sort of getting in the zone in terms of textiles and when you're making. And it comes from the fact that I've always been really jealous of people that can sit and make textiles for hours and get really in the zone, and I just can't seem to do it. So I've been trying to capture ways of doing that. And as I've become more of a participatory artist, I've found that I'm intrigued as to how other people experience that on a short-term basis when they're not an experienced maker. So I'm going to give you an overview of a couple of projects that have explored that theme. So as I said, I use very simplistic materials when I'm engaging with people. This particular project, I used stickers, really simple. They're non-scary. So when I say accessible, I mean, I think if you turn up and do a textile project, if you show people yarn, needles, if they don't know how to knit, I think, or sew or weave, it can be quite intimidating. People don't want to approach it and they're a bit scared. And so my idea is to try and pass on textile making processes without people needing to learn the skills that are involved in that. Just as not in a, I don't believe they need teaching, and I think they do, but just as a preliminary engagement tool. And a lot of the times, these sort of materials are used in sort of a method of accumulative gestures, so which I think traditional textiles is. There's always a repetitive task that's going on. This particular project was called Stitch Type, and it took place in Winchester as part of a project called Making It, which was a weekend event, and I was one of 4 artists invited to do a live installation across a whole event over a weekend, and it took place in a library space called the Discovery Centre in Winchester. I don't know if any of you have been. It's a really nice space. And I worked on this giant glass balcony. And throughout the weekend, on the balcony, I plotted out this grid on sticky vinyl, which mimicked like a cross-stitch grid or any kind of textile grid, really. And the idea was that we were going to plot stitches, but they weren't physical stitches, they were stickers. And people were invited, because we're in a library space, I was looking at the link between text and textiles, and people were invited to donate words. So there was kind of 2 levels of participation, that people could just donate a word, and that would be the level of their engagement, or they could assist in plotting their word onto the grid. And we found that over the course of the weekend, partly because of it being a library space and it being really quiet, and I was up in like the study area, anyone that did actually take part in the physically making of the piece got really into it. It was like a really trance-like state, and everyone was really peaceful and quiet, and until you got to the end of your word, you didn't really hear anything from them, which I was fascinated by, that it was like every sticker you were putting on, you were making a stitch, and it became very concentrated and sort of carefully placed. But again, it was a short-term activity. And on the other end of the scale, people that were just donating it, I became quite fascinated by the engagement levels of this sort of peripheral audience, as I like to call them, that I never approached them. There was always just a sign that invited them to donate a word. It was an activity that related slightly, so the donation cards were set out like a grid as well, and a lot of people tended to try and then mimic what we were doing with the stitches, and they plotted out their own design. So I was quite fascinated by that motivation as to why people would want to engage when on that sort of outer level without being intimidated or having to cross a line. And so from this project, I became really interested in flow. I'm going to completely pronounce this guy's name wrong, but Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, I believe, is a sort of a psychologist who looked into this theory of flow. And I'm sure you've all come across the idea of being in the zone in either sports, in gaming, but I'm very interested in terms of textiles, as I said. And it can be summarised as an activity that engages an individual to the extent that they lose track of time and have a strong sense of fulfilment and achievement. It's the ultimate in focused intrinsic motivation, so it's an internal satisfaction. It's nothing to do with reward, external rewards. So following from this, I then went on to do a project with the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, and I really wanted to try and engage the public visiting the centre with their archives, which are very much separate to the space. It's not now they've had a renovation, but at the time, the archives are very much hidden away. And I was interested in trying to find different ways to get them to engage with the sort of the textile in specific. And I came across a whole series of weaving point papers. So these are like these beautifully hand-painted, massive graph papers, absolutely huge, with each square on a grid representing a single sort of stitch or over and under on a weft and warp. I said absolutely beautiful hand-painted things. And then these would have been converted into punch cards, which then became the final weave. And I looked quite a lot into kind of the theory of punch cards and how they get programmed in. And I got quite obsessed with that. And that's kind of where coding began to become a sort of at the background of my mind. But I wanted to use the same approach and create a sort of an accessible activity. And I wanted to try and devise an activity that would encapsulate flow in some way. That it would be a kind of repetitive gesture that people could get really engrossed in the activity, but it was still simple. And so in the end, people were given strips of paper with circles printed out on them, and they were invited to hole punch. They were each given a part of a grid, which was a section of the original point paper. And they were given just a line and said, right, that's your strip. You need to sit and copy that out. So it's very concentrated. It was more for adults. Kids struggled with that kind of focused attention. But I liked that I was trying to engage with adults, and especially males. So I was really quite satisfied that I got an equal number of males engaging in a textile activity. But I'm really pleased to see there's lots of males here today. And over time, these strips grew and they were placed up and they replicated the pattern. So we were just copying the activity, really. Trying to sort of, so this was only a temporal piece. It's nothing permanent. It's not meant to be a finished artwork itself. It's all about the process. And again, in replication of how weaving works, and knitting on a machine is very similar in that it grew row by row. And I also invited people to note down how they were feeling during the activity. And some people completed one, some people completed two, some people stayed and did more. And I even got the volunteers who rotate around the galleries to sit and do them while they were meant to be observing the activity. I'm not sure how much they were observing what was going on rather than just hole punching. But it was really nice because they rotated every 20 minutes, and there was a couple of them that would start a strip, and then they had to go to the next room, and then they'd come running back to come and complete their strip, which was really satisfying. And I wanted to find a way to assess whether people had achieved flow. This is a really simple graph that represents how you get into flow, where the flow zone sticks. And it's all based on your skill levels meeting the level of challenge, or challenge meeting your skill level. And if the challenge is too high for your skill level, you'll be anxious and worried and panicky, whereas if the challenge is too low for your skills, you'll be bored. So the ultimate is that your challenge is reflected, your skill level is matched by the challenge that you're given, and then you can get into the zone, you can happily create that. But equally, as your skills improve, the challenge needs to be increased. But with a short-term activity, that shouldn't be necessary. So I then looked into psychometric testing and experience sampling methods, which is Csikszentmihalyi developed this method of, it's basically a questionnaire, and I made a version of it that was a bit simplified, but it contained the essence of what I did not want to get into a full psychological study. I just wanted to capture an essence of what people had experienced. And it's all a rating system, and you just rate how you felt, and it's based on simple emotions. So were you excited, worried, relaxed, happy, cheerful, sad, lonely, bored, stressed, sociable? And you rated those on a 0 to 4, 0 to 3, which is 4 numbers. And I also invited people to do that before an activity and after the activity, and I later on invited the peripheral audience to do the same. So just as in the other project, I was interested in people just observing, because in the Whitworth Art Gallery they have this really interesting approach to participation and engagement, in that they quite often have these bookable activities that people are sat around a table doing an activity, but they're within the gallery space. So there's a whole sort of audience can then watch that activity happening. And I think it's quite interesting to watch the amount of people that wander through and are just like, they don't want to broach it and ask you about it or talk to you about it, but they're just like, oh, what's going on over there? You know. So I was quite interested in whether they would observe the activity that we're doing and how they would experience that, how they were feeling about it. And I love this picture because it's like an old man engaging with a young woman. They're just both casually observing the activity. And to assess that, so the people who filled in the form who were physically doing the activity clearly would have had enough of punching, because I've given them massive strips to do. But the people who were on the periphery, I gave them a mini activity to do, so their feedback was done in the form of a punch card. So after the activity, I was then left with this massive pile of ratings of how people felt during what they were doing, and needed a way to somehow visualise that. So accidentally, I think, turned to coding. I'm still learning, but loving it, and I've just since finding there's so many possibilities with it. But basically, with a little help from some coding friends, I coded the pattern with the feedback results, and because they were rated, it was easy to sort of affect it in different ways. So originally I worked on a grayscale, and then I whittled it down into the extremes, so if someone was very happy or very sad, and I looked at opposites. Now the nice thing about the original pattern that I was using is it was a two-colour, so there's a background and a foreground. And I wanted it to be that if you were in flow, the pattern was clear, and if you weren't in flow, the pattern becomes obscured. So I put the positive emotions affected the front, the foreground, the main pattern itself, and the negative emotions affected the background. So where you get these areas of disruption here, that's if someone was bored or sad, and then these more forefront ones are where they were very happy, etc. And I think you can see that the active participants had a very similar set of results to the peripheral audience, which I found really interesting. And then following that, I then took those results and turned them back into a punch card system and laser cut them for exhibition, taking the kind of in full circle. So since then, I've been trying to look into new ways, rather than sitting and having a feedback form that people have got to sit and do, because I think it's quite, a feedback form in itself is an activity, and I think there's a certain type of participant that will happily fill in a feedback form. And I think we all roll our eyes when we're asked to fill in a questionnaire of any form after an activity. And I think people tend to know, especially if it's, did you enjoy this activity? Would you do it again? And you're all like, yeah, I know, I need to tick those boxes. So I've been trying to find more hands-off ways of doing it. So I've been looking at biometric feedback, and initially using a pulse sensor and an Arduino. I've been looking at heart rate. I've not done masses of testing in terms of looking at how the heart rate is affected during flow, in terms of full research yet. I'm just at the early stages. But the theory is that if you're calm and you're relaxed doing an activity, your heart rate's going to be fairly steady. So this is an example of one bit of coding that I did with a simple dog tooth check, or houndstooth check, that's come from a knitting punch card. This is going to be knitted during an activity with some kids this weekend. We're going to hook them up to the heart rate monitor. And then this is a coded pattern using my heart rate. And it basically interferes in the same way that the other pattern did. So the pattern would be clear if I was super calm. And it gets disrupted otherwise. But the next stage is my new toy, which I can't really demonstrate because I've only had it 2 weeks. But I'm super excited. This is an EEG headset, which will basically read your brain waves. Doesn't mean I can read your mind. It just means it reveals whether you're engaged, excited, and whether you're in meditative stages, which should represent flow. So I'm currently working on code that will incorporate using this really unattractive headset, which messes with your hair, to do similar results to this. And so the idea is that there'll be some form of feedback during an activity, because I was a bit frustrated with the project that the coding took place after the event, and I want it to become more of a live experience, that I'll be able to display these results while people, and then I'm interested in if people can see that they're in flow, will they try and calm themselves and get more into flow while they're doing an activity? Yeah, that's it.